In the dust-choked valleys of Wyoming territory, where hope withers as quickly as the summer grass, Colt Merrick stands at the county auction with his last $20 and a heart heavy with loss. The weathered rancher watches as desperate men bid on indentured workers, souls sold to settle jail debts. His eyes settle on a young woman in shackles, wild hair catching the afternoon light, defiance burning in her green eyes despite the bruises. On her wrists, the auctioneer's voice cuts through the crowd. This one's called Wren, too wild for any decent man, they say. Escaped twice, fought like a wildcat. No refunds on this one, gentlemen. While other bidders shake their heads and step back, Colt raises his hand. He doesn't know that this broken girl will teach him to live again. But when a man's lost everything, sometimes salvation comes disguised as trouble. What secret is Wren hiding that could destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wagon wheels creaked along the rutted trail that led to the Merrick Ranch, each bump sending a jolt through Colt's weathered bones and drawing a sharp intake of breath from the young woman beside him. Wren sat rigid as a fence post, her chained, hands folded in her lap, green eyes scanning the horizon like a trapped animal calculating escape routes. The shackles around her wrists caught the dying sunlight, and Colt found himself wondering what kind of fool he'd been to spend his last money on a girl who looked ready to bolt the moment his back was turned. 3 years had passed since Sarah died. 3 years since the drought began its relentless assault on his land. The ranch that had once sprawled across 2,000 acres now felt like a monument to failure. Cattle that hadn't died of thirst had been sold off to pay debts, and the fields that used to wave with golden wheat now cracked like broken pottery. Under the merciless sun, the house Sarah had filled with laughter stood silent except for the whisper of wind through loose shutters. Colt touched the gold band on his finger, a habit that brought more pain than comfort these days. Sarah had believed in this land, in their dreams of raising children among the cottonwoods by the creek. She'd died believing he could make it work, could coax life from stubborn soil and build something lasting. Now he wasn't sure he could even keep the bank from taking what little remained. How much farther? Wren's voice cut through his brooding, sharp-edged with suspicion. Another mile or so? He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Up close, she looked younger than he'd first thought. Maybe 20, 21 at most. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves past her shoulders, and her clothes, though clean, had been mended so many times they resembled a patchwork quilt. But it was her eyes that held his attention. They held the wariness of someone who'd learned early that kindness usually came with a price. "What kind of work you expecting from me?" She shifted on the hard wagon seat, the chains clinking softly. "Ranch work. Feeding livestock, mending fence, whatever needs doing." He kept his voice level, matter of fact. "Nothing you can't handle, I expect." A bitter laugh escaped her. "You don't know what I can handle." "No, I reckon I don't." He pulled the wagon to a stop as they crested the hill overlooking his property. "But I know what I can't handle, and that's losing this place to the bank. So we'll figure it out together." The ranch spread below them in the gathering dusk, and Colt saw it through. Her eyes, the sagging barn roof, the empty pastures, the house that needed paint and new shingles. It wasn't much to look at anymore, but it was still home. The creek still ran clear when it ran at all, and the mountains still stood guard against the eastern sky like sleeping giants. "It's bigger than I expected," Wren admitted quietly. "Used. To be bigger. Used to be a lot of things." He clicked his tongue to get the horses moving again. "Sarah always said this land had good bones. Just needed the right touch to make it flourish again." "Sarah, your wife?" "Was." The word came out rougher than he intended. "Been gone 3 years now." Wren fell silent at that, and they completed the journey without further conversation. As they pulled up to the house, Colt noticed smoke rising from the chimney of the neighboring Bradley Ranch. Tom Bradley had been trying to convince him to sell for months, offering to buy him out before the bank foreclosed. Tom meant well, but he didn't understand that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. The front porch creaked under their weight as Colt led Wren to the door. He fumbled with the key, suddenly self-conscious about the dust that had gathered on everything, the dishes he'd left unwashed in the sink, the general air of neglect that seemed to permeate the place. Sarah would have been mortified. "Your room's upstairs," he said, lighting an oil lamp against the growing darkness. "Second door on the right. I put some clothes up there that might fit. Belong to my wife. If you don't want to wear them, I understand." Wren stood in the center of the front room, taking in the faded wallpaper, the furniture covered in dust sheets, the cold fireplace that hadn't seen a flame in months. "Where do you sleep?" "Downstairs." "Sarah's sewing room." He didn't mention that he couldn't bear to sleep in their bedroom anymore, that he'd moved into the small room off the kitchen because it didn't carry her scent or hold memories of her laughter. "About these chains." She held up her wrists. Colt had almost forgotten about the shackles. The county sheriff had insisted they remain until Wren was settled, but looking at the raw marks on her skin where the metal had chafed, he felt ashamed. "I'll get them off you now." Should have done it sooner. He found the key in his jacket pocket and worked the locks while trying not to notice how she flinched when his fingers brushed her skin. The shackles fell away with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo through the quiet house. Wren rubbed her wrists, staring at the red marks the chains had left. "Most men would have kept them on." "I'm not most men." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. "No, I don't suppose you are." Something passed between them in that moment. Not trust exactly, but perhaps the possibility of it. Colt cleared his throat and moved toward the kitchen. "You hungry? I could fix us something to eat." "I can cook." She followed him, glancing around the tidy but lifeless kitchen. "Used to cook for the people who raised me." "The outlaws the sheriff mentioned." Her face shuttered immediately. "They weren't all bad. Some were just people who didn't fit anywhere else." Colt nodded, recognizing the defensive tone. He'd used it himself when people asked about his failed harvests or empty pastures. "Well, tomorrow we'll see about getting you started with the ranch work. For tonight, just get some rest. There's a basin and pitcher upstairs, soap too." Wren hesitated at the bottom of the stairs. "What happens if I run?" The question hung in the air between them, honest and stark. Colt considered his answer carefully. "I expect you'd get caught, and they'd send you somewhere worse than here, but that's your choice to make." "You wouldn't come after me." "Where would you go? You got family somewhere, money, a place that would take you in without asking questions." When she didn't answer, he shrugged. "Seems to me you're about as stuck as I am. Might as well be stuck together." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good night, Mr. Merrick." "Colt, just Colt." "Good night, Colt." He listened to her footsteps on the stairs, the creak of floorboards overhead, the soft click of a door closing. Then the house settled into the familiar silence that had been his only companion for 3 long years. But tonight, somehow, the silence felt different, less empty. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance and the wind rattled the windows. Colt poured himself a whiskey and sat at the kitchen table, Sarah's wedding ring catching the lamplight as he turned it between his fingers. He'd gambled his last $20 on a girl with wild eyes and a dangerous past, and he still wasn't sure why. Maybe Tom Bradley was right. Maybe he should sell out, take what little he could get, and start over somewhere else. But as he sat in the house Sarah had loved, listening to the subtle sounds of another person moving around upstairs, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a tiny spark of hope. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The banknote was still due, the cattle still needed feeding, and he had a fugitive upstairs who might disappear before dawn. But tonight, for the first time since Sarah's funeral, Colt Merrick wasn't completely alone. He finished his whiskey and climbed the stairs, pausing outside Wren's door. No sound came from within, but he could see lamplight underneath the doorframe. She was awake, probably planning her escape. or wondering what kind of man would bid on a stranger at an auction. "Sleep well," he whispered to the closed door, then made his way to his own lonely room, where Sarah's absence waited like an old friend. The morning sun painted the kitchen in shades of gold when Colt came downstairs to find Wren already at the stove, her hair braided back and wearing one of Sarah's old work dresses. The blue cotton hung loose on her smaller frame, but she'd belted it tight and rolled up the sleeves. The sight of another woman in his wife's clothes should have bothered him, but instead he felt a strange sense of rightness, as if the dress had been waiting all this time to be worn again. "Coffee's ready," Wren said without turning around. "Found some eggs in the hen house and biscuits in the pantry. Hope you don't mind." "Mind? I haven't had a proper breakfast in months." Colt poured himself coffee from the pot, surprised by how strong and good it tasted. "You're up early? Couldn't sleep much? Too quiet here." She flipped the eggs with practiced ease. "Where I come from, there was always noise. Horses, men talking, someone playing cards or singing. This silence is different. You'll get used to it." He settled at the table, watching her work. There was an economy to her movements, an efficiency that spoke of years cooking for hungry people. "You mentioned the people who raised you. They teach you to cook like this?" Her shoulders tensed slightly. "Among other things." Before Colt could ask what other things, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look toward the window. A rider was coming up the drive at a steady pace, and Colt recognized the bay mare before he could make out the rider's face. "Sheriff Stone," he muttered. Wren's face went pale. The spatula slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. "He's come for me. Easy now." Colt stood, his voice calm despite the sudden tension in the room. "Let me talk to him." But Wren was already backing toward the rear door, her green eyes wide with panic. "I won't go back. I won't let them put me in a cage again. Nobody's putting you anywhere." Colt moved to block her path to the door. "Just stay calm and let me handle this." The knock came firm and authoritative. Colt opened the front door to find Sheriff Marcus Stone standing on his porch, hat in hand but badge gleaming on his vest. Stone was a good man, fair-minded and honest, but he was also a man who followed the law to the letter. "Morning, Colt. Hope I'm not interrupting your breakfast." "Not at all, Marcus. Coffee's hot if you want some." Stone glanced past him into the house. "Actually, I came to talk about your new hired hand, the girl from the auction. What about her? Mind if I come in?" "This isn't exactly a conversation for the front porch." Colt stepped aside reluctantly. Stone entered and immediately spotted Wren standing frozen by the kitchen door, her face a mask of defiance over barely controlled fear. "Miss Wren, isn't it?" Stone's voice was gentle but official. "I'm Sheriff Stone. I need to ask you a few questions." "I haven't done anything wrong," Wren said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Maybe not since you've been here, but there are some things from before that need clearing up." Stone accepted the coffee Colt offered but didn't sit down. "See, I got a telegram yesterday from the federal marshals. They've been tracking a young woman matching your description. Goes by several names, but they think her real name might be Elizabeth Morrison." Wren's face went completely white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Elizabeth Morrison disappeared from her father's estate in Colorado 3 months ago. Day before, she was supposed to marry a prominent businessman. Her father's offering a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return." "I'm not Elizabeth Morrison," Wren said, but her voice lacked conviction. Stone studied her carefully. "Federal marshals seem to think different. They're sending someone to question you. Should be here by the end of the week." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Colt saw Wren sway slightly, saw her hand grip the doorframe for support. "Marcus, this girl's been through enough. Can't you see she's scared?" "I can see that, and I'm not unsympathetic. But if she's who they think she is, this is bigger than just a runaway girl. There are legal implications, property rights, marriage contracts." Stone's tone remained professional, but Colt caught the apologetic look in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Colt, but I have to ask her to stay in the county until this gets sorted out." "And if I refuse?" Wren's voice was barely above a whisper. Then I'll have to arrest you and hold you in jail until the marshals arrive. I'd rather not do that, but I will if I have to. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the mantel clock and the distant lowing of cattle. Colt watched Wren's face, saw the moment when desperation shifted to resignation. She'd been running for 3 months, and now the chase was finally over. How long do I have? She asked. The marshals will be here Friday. Today's Monday. Stone set down his coffee cup. I'm sorry about this, miss, I truly am, but sometimes the law doesn't leave us much choice. After Stone left, Wren stood motionless in the kitchen for a long time. Colt busied himself cleaning up the abandoned breakfast, giving her space to process what had just happened. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. I should go tonight, before he comes back. Where would you go? I don't know. Mexico, maybe, or Canada, somewhere they can't find me. Colt turned to face her. And then what? Spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder? Never staying anywhere long enough to call it home? It's better than the alternative. What? Alternative? Going back to your father, your fiancé? Wren's laugh was bitter. You don't understand. You don't know what they're like, what they'll do to me. Then tell me. For a moment he thought she might. Her mouth opened, words seeming to form on her lips, but then she shook her head and turned away. It doesn't matter. In 4 days, none of this will matter. It matters to me. The words surprised them both. Wren spun around, searching his face. Why? You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you're not the wild, dangerous girl they painted you as. I know you've been hurt and you're scared, and you're braver than you think you are. He took a step closer. I know that in one morning you've made this house feel more like a home than it has in 3 years. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Don't be kind to me. It makes it harder. Good. Maybe it should be hard. Maybe running isn't the answer. You don't understand. Then help me understand. Tell me what happened. Tell me why you're so afraid of going back. For a long moment they stood there in the golden morning light, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Then Wren shook her head and headed for the stairs. I need to think. Colt watched her go, his heart heavy with the knowledge that come Friday, the marshals would take her away, back to a life she'd risked everything to escape, back to people who'd driven her to live among outlaws rather than stay under their roof. Spent the day working alone, mending fence and checking on the few head of cattle he had left. But his mind kept drifting to the woman upstairs, to the fear in her eyes when Stone mentioned her real name, Elizabeth Morrison. It sounded like someone from a different world, someone with money and status and a life laid out before her like a red carpet. But the woman who'd made him breakfast and worn Sarah's dress with such careful respect, she was just Wren, a girl who'd been running so long she'd forgotten how to stand still. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Colt made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He found Wren sitting on the front porch, staring out at the darkening landscape. I've been thinking, he said, settling into the chair beside her. About what? About Friday. About what happens when the marshals come. She turned to look at him, hope and fear warring in her expression. I think, Colt said slowly, that if you're going to run, you shouldn't run alone. The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Wren stared at Colt in the gathering twilight, her green eyes reflecting the last traces of sunset. You don't mean that, she said finally. I wouldn't have said it if I didn't mean it. You'd give up everything? This ranch, your life here, all for someone you met yesterday? Colt leaned back in his chair, considering the question seriously. The ranch was failing anyway, had been failing long before Wren arrived. The bank would foreclose within months. Whether he stayed or went, but there was more to it than simple arithmetic. This place died with Sarah, he said quietly. I've just been too stubborn to admit it. Maybe it's time to start over somewhere new. Wren shook her head. You don't understand what you'd be getting into. The people looking for me, they have. Money, power, connections, they won't just give up. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are. We. She repeated the word like she was testing its weight. There is no we, Colt. There's just me and the mess I've made of my life. Seems to me there's more to it than that. He studied her profile in the dim light. A person doesn't run from a good life. Whatever you left behind, it was bad enough that living with outlaws seemed like a better choice. A bitter smile crossed her lips. The outlaws were kinder to me than my own family ever was. Tell me about them. The people who raised you. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she drew her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself small against the vastness of the night. Their leader was a man named Jake Malone, Irish, with hands scarred from fighting and a laugh that could fill a room. He found me when I was 16, half dead from hunger and cold, trying to steal food from their camp. Her voice grew distant, remembering. Any decent person would have turned me over to the authorities. Jake gave me stew and a blanket and asked if I wanted to stay. What about your real family, your father? My father. The words came out like a curse. Harrison Morrison, railroad baron and pillar of society. Do you know what he told me the day I turned 18? That I'd been purchased like a prize heifer, sold to Harold Blackwood to seal a business deal. Colt felt a cold anger building in his chest. Sold? A marriage contract signed when I was 12 years old. Blackwood gets a young wife and access to my father's railroad connections. My father gets to expand his empire into mining territory. She shrugged. I get to be property. So you ran. I tried to fight it first, pleaded, argued, threw every tantrum I could think of. My father had me locked in my room for 2 weeks to come to my senses. When that didn't work, he brought in tutors to teach me how to be a proper wife, how to dress, how to speak, how to submit. Her voice hardened. Harold Blackwood is 63 years old. His first 2 wives died under mysterious circumstances, but my father didn't care about that. The only thing that mattered was the money. The pieces were falling into place now, painting a picture that made Colt's stomach turn. The night you disappeared was supposed to be my wedding night. I'd planned it for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Jake had taught me how to pick locks, how to move quietly, how to disappear. I took only what I could carry and ran. She was quiet for a moment. I'd been running ever since. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead. A carved wooden horse peeked out from Wren's coat pocket, something she'd been carrying when she arrived, though she thought she'd hidden it from his notice. It was small, crude, obviously made by inexperienced hands, but she clutched it like a talisman. "Jake make that for you?" Colt asked gently. Wren's hand flew to her pocket, startled. "I thought I'd hidden it better. Old habits from watching for predators, I expect. Mind if I see it?" She hesitated, then pulled out the little horse. It was carved from pine, painted brown with white markings, no bigger than her palm. The paint was worn from handling, and one ear had been carefully glued back on. Jake carved it my first Christmas with them. Said everyone needed something to remind them of home. She turned it over in her hands. "I know it's foolish, carrying it around like a child. It's not foolish. We all have things that keep us anchored." Colt touched his wedding ring. "The question is whether we let them keep us in the past or help us move toward the future." The next morning, Wren proved her worth in ways Colt hadn't expected. She was up before dawn, had the coffee ready and breakfast cooking when he came. Downstairs, but it was what happened afterward that truly surprised him. "Show me the livestock," she said as they finished eating. Colt led her to the barn, pointing out the few remaining cattle, the chickens, the pair of draft horses that were his pride and joy. Wren walked among the animals with an easy confidence that spoke of long familiarity. "This mare's favoring her left front hoof," she observed, running her hands along the horse's leg with practiced skill. "Stone bruise, most likely. Few days of rest and some warm poultices should fix it right up." "How'd you learn so much about horses?" "Jake's gang specialized in horse trading, among other things." She straightened up, meeting his eyes. "I know what you're thinking. Horse thieves." "I wasn't thinking anything. Yes, you were, and you're probably right about some of it, but Jake taught me to read sign, to doctor animals, to survive in country that would kill most people. Those aren't skills you learn in a finishing school. She moved to examine the cattle next, her hands gentle but thorough as she checked each animal. This one's pregnant, due within the month, I'd say, and that bull there, he's got proud flesh on his shoulder. Been fighting, probably. Colt stared at her in amazement. You can tell all that just by looking? Jake always said animals don't lie. They tell you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen. She wiped her hands on the towel he offered. Your herd's in good shape considering the drought. Better than I expected. There used to be more. A lot more. What happened to them? Sold them off to pay debts? Kept just what I needed for breeding stock. He leaned against the fence, watching her work. You really think that mare will be all right? Give me some clean rags and whatever you use for poultices. I'll have her sound in a week. Wren paused, realizing what she'd just offered. If I'm still here, that is. The reminder of her precarious situation cast a shadow over the morning. 3 more days until the marshals arrived. 3 days to decide whether to run or stay and face whatever consequences awaited her. That afternoon, as Colt worked on repairing a section of fence, he caught glimpses of Wren moving around the barnyard. She'd found his wife's gardening tools and was attacking the weeds that had taken over Sarah's vegetable patch. The sight should have bothered him. Another woman touching Sarah's things, working in Sarah's garden, but instead he felt grateful. The garden had been dying along with everything else, but under Wren's careful attention, it might live again. Tom Bradley rode over around sunset, ostensibly to check on Colt, but clearly curious about his new hired hand. Tom was a good neighbor, had been a friend of Sarah's, but he'd never quite understood why Colt couldn't just let go and move on. Heard you picked up a helper at the auction, Tom said, dismounting near the porch where Colt sat watching Wren. Tend to the injured mare. News travels fast. Small county, people talk. Tom's eyes followed Wren's movements. That the girl they say escaped from jail twice? That's what they say. You sure it's wise, Colt, bringing someone like that onto your property? Colt stood slowly, his voice taking on an edge. Someone like what, Tom? You know what I mean. Criminal element. Wild type. Sarah wouldn't have... Sarah's not here. The words came out harder than Colt intended. And that girl's been nothing but helpful since she arrived. Works harder than most men I've known. Tom held up his hands in a placating gesture. I'm just looking out for you, old friend. Don't want to see you get hurt. I appreciate that, but I can take care of myself. As if summoned by their conversation, Wren approached, leading the mare, her movements confident and sure. The horse walked without favoring her injured hoof, clearly improved from whatever treatment Wren had administered. Mr. Bradley, she said politely, though Colt noticed the guarded look in her eyes. Miss, Tom touched his hat brim. Colt says, you've got a way with horses. I know a few things. Where'd you learn, if you don't mind my asking? The question hung in the air, and Colt saw Wren's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Here and there, you pick things up when you need to. Tom's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm sure you do. Well, I should be getting back. Mary's got supper waiting. He mounted his horse and looked down at Colt. Think about what I said. Sometimes the smart thing and the right thing aren't the same. After Tom left, Wren finished settling the mare in her stall with quiet efficiency. He doesn't trust me, she observed. Tom's protective. He's been worried about me since Sarah died. He's right to be suspicious. Wren latched the stall door and turned to face him. I am dangerous, Colt. Not in the way they think, maybe, but dangerous all the same. Everyone who gets close to me ends up getting hurt. Is that what happened with the outlaws? They got hurt because of you. Pain flashed across her features. The marshals caught up with us 2 months ago. There was a gunfight. Jake... She stopped, unable to finish. He died protecting you. He died because of me. Because I brought trouble to people who'd shown me nothing but kindness. Her voice broke slightly. That's why I can't let you help me, Colt. I won't be responsible for destroying your life, too. Colt stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. Seems to me Jake made his own choice, just like I'm making mine. You don't understand. I understand that you're scared. I understand that you've been running so long, you've forgotten what it feels like to have someone stand with you instead of against you. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek. I understand that 3 days isn't nearly enough time to figure out what's happening between us, but I'm willing to find out if you are. For a moment, she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. Then she stepped back, shaking her head. 3 days, she whispered. That's all we have. But as she walked back to the house in the gathering darkness, Colt noticed she'd left the little wooden horse on the fence post beside him, a sign, perhaps, that despite her words, she wasn't ready to run just yet. The second morning brought an unexpected gift. Colt woke to find a small bouquet of wildflowers on his kitchen table, prairie roses, Indian paintbrush, and lupine gathered from the meadow beyond the creek. They sat in a mason jar, their colors bright against the worn wood, and filled the room with a sweetness he'd almost forgotten existed. Wren was already outside when he stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand. She'd found his toolbox and was repairing the broken latch on the chicken coop, her movements efficient and sure. The sight of her in the early morning light, dark hair catching the sun as she worked, stirred something in his chest that had been dormant for far too long. "Thank you," he called out, holding up the flowers. She glanced over, a flush rising in her cheeks. They were just growing wild. Seemed a shame to let them go to waste. Sarah used to pick wildflowers, kept them all over the house. He walked closer, watching her hands as she tightened the latch mechanism. "Where'd you learn to fix things like that?" Jake again said a person should know how to repair what breaks, whether it's a door latch or a broken heart. Her voice caught, slightly on the last words. Though I'm not sure he was right about the second part. Maybe healing just takes longer than fixing. She looked up at him then, something vulnerable in her expression. "Is that what you think I need?" "Healing? I think we both do." They worked together throughout the morning, Colt teaching her the rhythms of ranch life, while she shared hard-won knowledge about reading weather signs and animal behavior. She had an instinct for the work that surprised him, could sense when a cow was about to calve, knew which plants would soothe a colicky horse, moved through the barnyard with a natural grace that spoke of deep understanding. "Jake taught you?" "Well," Colt observed as they paused for lunch, "Jake taught me to survive. Everything else I had to figure out on my own." She unwrapped the sandwiches she'd prepared, her expression thoughtful. "He used to say that running was just another kind of prison if you never learned to stand still long enough to live." Sounds like a wise man. He was, but wisdom doesn't stop bullets. The pain in her voice was raw, unguarded. "I keep thinking if I'd been smarter, faster, maybe he'd still be alive. Or maybe you'd both be dead." Colt's tone was gentle but firm. "Sometimes the only choice is between one tragedy and a worse one." That afternoon brought an unexpected test of Wren's skills. One of the cows, a young heifer Colt had been particularly fond of, went into difficult labor in the far pasture. By the time they reached her, she was in obvious distress, the calf positioned wrong and both mother and baby at risk. "We need to get her to the barn," Colt said, but Wren was already kneeling beside the struggling animal. No time. The calf's breached. Her hands moved with calm expertise, examining the situation. "I can turn it, but I'll need your help to keep her calm." What followed was an hour of intense, careful work. Wren's small hands were an advantage as she gently repositioned the calf, her voice a constant murmur of encouragement to the frightened cow. Colt held the heifer's head, stroking her neck and speaking in low, soothing tones, marveling at how naturally he and Wren worked together. When the calf finally emerged, wet and perfect and bleating with indignation, both humans sat back in exhausted relief. The mother cow immediately began cleaning her baby, her earlier distress forgotten in the face of new motherhood. "That was incredible," Colt said, watching Wren clean her hands in the creek. "Where did you learn to do that?" Jake's gang wintered in rough country sometimes. Animals got into trouble, and there wasn't always a veterinarian around. She dried her hands on her skirt, smiling at the sight of the wobbly-legged calf trying to nurse. Besides, bringing life into the world never gets old, no matter how many times you do it. "Sarah would have loved this," Colt said without thinking. "She always said birth was the closest thing to magic she'd ever seen." Wren's smile faded slightly. "Tell me about her, about Sarah." They sat by the creek as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, and Colt found himself talking about his wife in a way he hadn't been able to since her death. He told Wren about Sarah's laugh, her terrible cooking when they were first married, the way she could coax vegetables from the most stubborn soil. He talked about their dreams for the ranch, their plans for children, the quiet contentment of their life together. "She sounds wonderful," Wren said when he finished. She was. "She was everything good and bright in my world." He picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the creek's surface. "I thought when she died that the good part of my life was over, that all I had left was hanging on until my time came too. And now? Now I'm not so sure. These past few days." He looked at her, this wild-haired girl who'd stumbled into his life like a gift he didn't know he needed. "You make me remember what it feels like to look forward instead of back." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. Then Wren stood abruptly, brushing off her skirt. "We should head back. It'll be dark soon." But as they walked toward the house, she surprised him by reaching for his hand. Her fingers were small and calloused, scarred from hard living, but they fit perfectly in his. Neither of them spoke about the gesture, but neither pulled away either. That evening, Colt made a decision that would have shocked his neighbors. He pulled out Sarah's collection of books, volumes of poetry, novels, even some technical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry, and offered to teach Wren to read better. "I can read some," she protested, but he'd noticed her struggling with the newspaper he'd left on the kitchen table. "Jake teach you?" "A little. Mostly I picked it up from wanted posters and newspaper headlines." She ran her fingers over the leather binding of a volume of Tennyson. "These are beautiful books." Sarah loved to read, always said books were windows into other worlds. He opened the poetry collection to a page marked with a pressed flower. "She used to read to me in the evenings. Her voice made even the most complicated verses sound like music. I don't want to intrude on your memories." "You're not intruding, you're adding to them." He settled beside her on the sofa, close enough to smell the wildflower scent in her hair. "Besides, seems a shame to let all this knowledge gather dust." They started with simple poems, Wren's voice halting at first as she sounded out unfamiliar words. But she was a quick learner, and soon she was reading with growing confidence. When she stumbled over a particularly difficult passage, Colt would help, their heads bent close together over the pages. "The Lady of Shalott," Wren read slowly. "She left the web, she left the loom, she made 3 paces through the room." "That's beautiful," she said when she finished the stanza. "Sad but beautiful. What happens to her?" "Keep reading, you'll see." As the evening wore on, they moved from poetry to one of Sarah's novels, an adventure story about pirates and treasure, that made Wren laugh out loud at the more ridiculous plot twists. The sound of her laughter filled the house with life it hadn't known in years. "This is silly," she said, giggling as the hero swung from a chandelier to rescue the heroine. "No one actually does things like this," says the girl who escaped from jail twice and lived with outlaws. "That's different. That was survival, not romance." But she was still smiling as she said it. When they finally closed the book, the fire had burned down to embers, and the night was deep around them. Wren stretched, then seemed to realize how close they were sitting, how intimate the evening had become. "I should go to bed," she said, but she made no move to leave. Wren. Her name came out softer than he'd intended. "What happens Friday? When the marshals come?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. 2 days. They had 2 days. Left before the outside world intruded on this fragile thing growing between them. "I don't know," she whispered. I've been running for so long I don't remember what it feels like to stay. Maybe it's time to find out." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the exact moment when her resolve began to crack. "What if they take me away? What if I never see you again? Then we'll have had this." He reached up to touch her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. Sometimes a few perfect days are worth a lifetime of ordinary ones. For a heartbeat, he thought she might kiss him. The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility. Then she pulled back, shaking her head. "I can't. I won't let you sacrifice everything for someone who might not even be able to stay." She stood quickly and headed for the stairs, but paused at the bottom step. "Thank you for the books, for the reading lesson, for—" She gestured helplessly. "For making me feel human again. You are human, Wren. More human than most people I know." After she disappeared upstairs, Colt sat alone by the dying fire, turning his wedding ring on his finger. For 3 years, that ring had been a chain binding him to the past. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like a bridge, not holding him back, but connecting what was with what might be. Outside, a nightbird called across the darkness, and somewhere in the distance a coyote answered, the sounds of the wild, untamed and free. Like the woman sleeping upstairs, who'd brought wildflowers to his table and laughter to his house, and the possibility of hope to his carefully guarded heart. 2 more days. Whatever happened Friday, he'd make sure they counted. The 3rd morning dawned grey and overcast, matching the weight that had settled in Colt's chest. 1 more day. Tomorrow the federal marshals would arrive, and this strange, wonderful interlude would end. He found Wren in the kitchen as usual, but something was different. She moved with the careful precision of someone holding herself together, by force of will, and when she handed him his coffee, her fingers trembled slightly. "Sleep well?" he asked, though the shadows under her eyes suggested otherwise. "Well enough." She turned back to the stove, her voice determinedly bright. "I thought I might clean the house today. Seems like it could use a woman's touch." The offer should have pleased him, but instead it filled him with unease. There was something deliberate about it, as if she were trying to leave some mark of her presence before disappearing forever. "You don't have to do that." "I want to. I've never had a real home to take care of." She paused, her back still to him. "Would it bother you if I went through Sarah's things? I noticed some boxes in the closet upstairs." The question hit him like a physical blow. Sarah's belongings, her clothes, her jewelry, her personal effects, had been packed away after the funeral. Too painful to look at, but too precious to discard. In 3 years, he hadn't been able to bring himself to open those boxes. "I don't know if that's a good idea," he said carefully. "I understand." But there was hurt in her voice, quickly. "Hidden. I just thought, never mind. It was presumptuous of me." Colt studied her profile, noting the way she held her shoulders rigid, the careful control in her movements. "It's not that I don't trust you. It's just, those boxes contain memories I'm not sure I'm ready to face. Sometimes facing things is the only way to move past them." She finally turned to look at him, and he saw understanding in her green eyes. "But I won't push. It's your choice to make." After breakfast, Colt threw himself into ranch work with desperate energy, trying to outrun the growing certainty that he was about to lose something precious. He repaired fence lines that didn't need repairing, reorganized the tool shed, even started plans for expanding the chicken coop, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind off tomorrow's inevitable arrival. But it was impossible to ignore. The sounds coming from the house, the sweep of a broom, the splash of water in a bucket, the soft humming of someone who was trying very hard to stay cheerful. When he came in for lunch, he stopped short in the doorway. The house was transformed. Every surface gleamed with careful cleaning. Fresh wildflowers brightened each room, and the windows sparkled with late afternoon sunlight. But it was more than just cleanliness. Wren had somehow made the place feel alive again, as if she'd breathed warmth back into rooms that had been merely existing for far too long. "It looks amazing," he said, and meant it. "Thank you." She smoothed her apron nervously. "I hope I didn't overstep." I moved a few things, rearranged some furniture. You made it feel like home again." The words seemed to break something inside her. Her carefully maintained composure crumbled, and tears she'd been holding back all day finally spilled over. "I'm sorry. I'm not usually so emotional. It's just, hey." He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pulled her into his arms. "It's all right. You don't have to apologize for having feelings." She buried her face against his chest, her whole body shaking with suppressed sobs. "I've never had anything like this. Never had someone who made me feel safe just by being near them. And tomorrow it's all going to end. Maybe it doesn't have to end. You know it does." She pulled back to look at him, her eyes red but determined. "Even if I could stay, even if somehow we could make this work, I'd always be looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the past to catch up. That's no way to live, and it's no way to love someone." The word hung between them, charged with meaning neither had been willing to acknowledge until now. Love. Such a simple word for something so complicated. "Is that what this is?" Colt asked quietly. "Love? I don't know. I've never felt anything like it before." She touched his face with gentle fingers. "Have you? Since Sarah?" The question cut deep, forcing him to confront truths he'd been avoiding. "No. I thought I never would again. Thought that part of my life was over. But you make me want to try. You make me remember what it feels like to have something worth fighting for." They stood there in the gleaming kitchen, holding each other as if they could stop time through sheer force of will. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the wind picked up, rattling the windows with growing intensity. "There's something I need to show you," Wren said suddenly. "Something I found while I was cleaning." She led him upstairs to the master bedroom, the room he hadn't entered since Sarah's death. Wren had cleaned here too, he realized, aired out the mustiness and let in the light. On the bed lay an open wooden box, and beside it, several items, arranged with careful reverence. "I found this in the wardrobe," Wren explained. "I know you said not to go through her things, but the box was open, and these fell out." Sarah's recipe book lay open to a page titled "Apple Butter, Grandmother's Recipe." Beside it were photographs. Sarah in her wedding dress, laughing at something outside the camera's view. Sarah in the garden, soil on her hands and joy on her face. Sarah and Colt together on their wedding day, so young and full of hope it made his chest ache. But it was the letter that undid him completely. Written in Sarah's careful script on their anniversary paper, it was dated just weeks before her death. "My dearest Colt," Wren read softly, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And you're probably thinking you'll never love again. But I know you better than that. I know the size of your heart, the depth of your capacity for caring. Please don't let my death become your prison." "I can't," Colt said roughly, turning away. "I can't hear this." "She loved you enough to want you to be happy," Wren continued gently. "She loved you enough to give you permission to love again. But not like this. Not with someone who's going to disappear tomorrow. Maybe that's exactly why." Wren set the letter down carefully. "Maybe loving someone you might lose teaches you not to waste the time you have." That evening, as the promised storm rolled across the mountains, they cooked dinner together from one of Sarah's recipes. It should have felt wrong, using his dead wife's instructions to prepare a meal with another woman, but instead it felt like a blessing, as if Sarah were somehow giving her approval to this fragile, beautiful thing growing between them. "She was a good cook," Wren observed, tasting the stew. "Better than me." "Different, not better or worse, just different." Colt watched her move around the kitchen with increasing familiarity. Sarah was comfortable, like a warm fire on a cold night. "You're more like lightning, dangerous and beautiful and impossible to predict." "Is that good or bad?" "It's honest." They ate by candlelight as rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled across the sky. The storm seemed to heighten the sense of isolation, of being cut off from the world and its demands. In this small circle of warmth and light, it was easy to pretend that tomorrow would never come. I keep thinking about what you said, Wren said as they cleaned up, about running away together. And I think you're crazy, but she was smiling as she said it. Crazy and wonderful and everything I never thought I'd find. But I can't ask you to give up your life for me. This ranch, this land, it's part of who you are, and I'm nobody, a girl with no real name and no real future. You're wrong about that. Colt set down the dish he was drying and turned to face her fully. You're somebody to me. You're the person who brought flowers to my table and laughter to my house. You're the woman who helped birth a calf and read poetry by firelight and made me remember what hope feels like. Colt, I love you. The words came out stark and simple, cutting through all her protests. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you hum when you think no one's listening. I love that you see the good in broken things and believe they can be fixed. I love you, and I don't care if we've only known each other 3 days, or if loving you is the most foolish thing I've ever done. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and terrifying in its intensity. Wren stared at him with wide eyes, her lips parted in surprise. You don't mean that, she whispered. I've never meant anything more in my life. For a moment he thought she might run, might bolt upstairs or out into the storm rather than face the magnitude of what he'd just offered. Instead, she stepped closer, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. I love you too, she said, the words barely audible above the rain. God help me, I love you too. And then she was kissing him, fierce and desperate and sweet, as if she could pour all her feelings into that single connection. He kissed her back with equal fervor, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her closer as lightning illuminated the kitchen in stark white brilliance. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the storm outside seemed to echo the tumult in their hearts. Tomorrow, Wren began. Tomorrow we'll figure it out, Colt said firmly. Tonight is ours. But even as he spoke the words, he could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear that loving him was just another way of hurting him. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in the darkness, the future waited with all its uncertainty and pain. One more day, one more night, and then they'd learn whether love was strong enough to overcome the forces arrayed against them. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a world, washed clean and gleaming. Colt woke to sunlight streaming through his window and the sound of Wren singing softly in the kitchen below. For a moment, he allowed himself to pretend this was just another ordinary morning in a life they'd built together, that the Marshalls weren't coming today, that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. But reality had a way of intruding, even on perfect mornings. He found Wren at the stove, her hair braided back and a forced smile on her lips. She was wearing the blue dress again, Sarah's dress, but somehow she'd made it entirely her own. The sight of her in the morning light, trying so hard to be brave, nearly broke his heart. Morning, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. Coffee's ready? Wren. He crossed to her, gently turning her to face him. About last night, I know. You're having second thoughts. It's all right, I understand. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been rehearsing them. The things we said, they were just heat of the moment, the storm, the emotions. Stop. He silenced her with a gentle finger to her lips. I'm not having second thoughts. Are you? She searched his face, looking for signs of deception or regret. No, but maybe I should be. Maybe we both should be. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the morning quiet. Multiple riders moving at a steady pace up the drive. Colt's stomach dropped as he recognized the gleam of badges and the authoritative bearing of law enforcement. They're early, Wren breathed, her face going pale. Colt moved to the window, counting riders. 3 men, well-armed and official-looking. The federal marshals, along with Sheriff Stone, bringing up the rear. Stay here. Let me talk to them first. No. Wren straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of courage he was only beginning to understand. I won't hide anymore. Whatever happens, we face it together. They stepped onto the porch as the riders approached. The lead marshal was a tall, thin man with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter sky. His badge caught the morning sun as he dismounted, his movements precise and economical. "You Colt Merrick?" he asked without preamble. "I am. Marshal James Crawford, Federal Service. This is Marshal Torres." He gestured to his companion, a younger man with sharp eyes and a carefully neutral expression. "We're here about the woman you purchased at auction, Elizabeth Morrison." "Her name is Wren," Colt said firmly. "Her legal name is Elizabeth Morrison, daughter of Harrison Morrison of Morrison Railroad Company. She's been missing for 3 months, and her family is very anxious for her safe return." Wren stepped forward then, her chin raised in defiance. "I'm not missing, I left. There's a difference." Marshal Crawford studied her with professional interest. "Miss Morrison, I presume. You match the description perfectly. Your father has been very worried." "My father has been very embarrassed," Wren corrected. "There's a difference there too. Nevertheless, you're a minor. I'm 22 years old, who left her legal guardian's custody without permission. We're here to escort you home safely, and if I refuse to go," Crawford's expression didn't change, "then we'll arrest you for theft of property and transport you back to Colorado to face charges. Your father has documentation of several valuable items that went missing the night you disappeared." Colt felt his hands clench into fists. What kind of father presses charges against his own daughter? The kind who suffered considerable embarrassment and financial loss due to her actions. Crawford replied coolly. "Miss Morrison was legally contracted to marry Harold Blackwood. Her disappearance has caused significant damage to both families' reputations and business interests." "You can't force someone to marry against their will," Colt protested. "The marriage contract was signed by her legal guardian when she was a minor. It's perfectly valid under Colorado law." Crawford pulled out a folded document. "This is a writ demanding her immediate return. You can read it if you like, but the legal language is quite clear." Wren's face had gone ashen, but her voice remained steady. "What if I'm already married? What if I've taken another husband?" Crawford raised an eyebrow. "Have you?" She faltered, glancing at Colt. "Marriage requires proper documentation. Miss Morrison, a license, witnesses, official ceremony. Do you have such documentation?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Colt saw the trap closing around them, saw how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered by people with money and power, and the law on their side. "I thought not," Crawford said with satisfaction. "Now, if you'll gather your things, we'd like to be on the road within the hour. It's a long ride back to Colorado." "Wait." Colt stepped between Wren and the marshals. "What if she doesn't want to go? What if she chooses to stay here of her own free will? Then she'll be arrested and extradited anyway." "Mr. Merrick, I understand your attachment to the young lady, but the law is quite clear on this matter. She's the property of her family until she marries, and she's contracted to marry Mr. Blackwood." "Property?" Colt spat the word like a curse. "You're talking about a human being, not a piece of livestock. I'm talking about legal contracts and family obligations. Now, Miss Morrison, your things?" Wren stood frozen for a moment, then turned toward the house. But instead of going inside, she walked to the porch rail and picked up something Colt hadn't noticed, a silver locket that had been lying beside the morning coffee cups. "Before I go," she said, her voice carrying a strange new confidence, "I think you should see this." She opened the locket with careful fingers, revealing a miniature photograph inside. Crawford glanced at it dismissively, then looked again, his expression sharpening. "Where did you get this?" "It was my mother's. Her real name was Catherine Whitmore." Wren's voice grew stronger with each word. "She was the daughter of Judge William Whitmore of Denver. Perhaps you've heard of him?" Crawford's face had gone very still. "Judge Whitmore died 15 years ago." "Yes, and his daughter, my mother, died shortly after I was born. She was never legally married to Harrison Morrison." Wren smiled, and there was something dangerous in it, which means, according to Colorado law, I'm illegitimate, and illegitimate children cannot inherit, cannot be bound by contracts signed by non-legal guardians, and certainly cannot be considered anyone's property. The silence that followed was profound. Marshal Torres shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, while Crawford stared at the locket as if it might explode. "This complicates things," Crawford admitted finally. "I imagine it does. Judge Whitmore was very particular about legal documentation. I'm told he kept meticulous records of all his family's affairs." Wren's smile widened. "I'm also told that he specifically disinherited any daughter who bore children out of wedlock, which means Harrison Morrison has been claiming rights to a fortune that was never his to claim." Colt stared at her in amazement. This was not the frightened girl who'd tried to run 2 days ago. This was someone who'd found her strength and was wielding it like a weapon. "Even if that's true," Crawford said slowly, "it doesn't change the fact that you lived under Morrison's roof, accepted his support. Under false pretenses, he claimed to be my legal guardian when he had no such authority." Wren stepped closer. To the marshal, her green eyes blazing. "He forced me into an engagement contract that has no legal standing. He imprisoned me in my own home when I refused to comply, and when I escaped his illegal custody, he reported me as a thief and a runaway." "Miss Morrison, Miss Whitmore," she corrected firmly. "That's my legal name, Catherine Whitmore's daughter. Not Morrison's property, not Blackwood's bride-to-be. Just a free woman making her own choices." Crawford looked like a man who'd stepped on what he thought was solid ground, only to discover quicksand. "These are serious allegations. They'll need to be investigated, documented. Then investigate them. But while you do, I'll be staying here with the man I choose to be with." "It's not that simple." "Actually," Sheriff Stone spoke for the first time, spurring his horse forward, "I think it might be. Marshal Crawford, if Miss Whitmore's claims prove true, then you have no legal authority to compel her return, and I have no grounds to hold her on theft charges that may have been falsely filed." Crawford's jaw tightened. "This will need to be resolved through proper legal channels." "Agreed," Wren said calmly. "I'm perfectly willing to appear before a judge to sort out these misunderstandings, but I'll do so as a free woman, not as anyone's prisoner." The marshal stared at her for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he folded the writ and tucked it back into his coat. "This isn't over, Miss Whitmore. There will be an investigation. Questions will be asked. I'm counting on it." After the marshals rode away, their departure as tense as their arrival, Colt and Wren stood on the porch in stunned silence. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last traces of the storm, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song. "That locket," Colt said finally. "How long have you had it?" "Always. It was the only thing of my mother's." "I was allowed to keep." Wren turned the small silver oval over in her hands. "I never understood why Harrison was so angry whenever he saw it. Now I know." "You think he knew? About your mother? About the inheritance?" "I think he's known all along. I think that's why he was so desperate to marry me off to Blackwood, to legitimize his claim to Judge Whitmore's estate before anyone could question it." Colt shook his head in amazement. "You've been sitting on evidence that could destroy him this whole time. I didn't know it was evidence. I just knew it was mine." She smiled up at him, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all morning. "But sometimes the things we carry for love turn out to be the things that set us free. So what happens now?" "Now?" Wren slipped the locket back into her pocket and moved into his arms. "Now we have time to figure out what we're building here. No more running, no more hiding. Just us and this ranch and all the possibilities ahead of us." Colt kissed her then, fierce and grateful and full of hope. When they broke apart, he could see tears in her eyes, but for the first time since he'd known her, they were tears of joy. "I love you, Elizabeth Whitmore," he said softly. "I love you too, but please call me Wren. Elizabeth was someone else's daughter. Wren is the woman who chose to stay." 3 weeks passed in a kind of golden haze. Wren, she would always be Wren. To him, regardless of legal names, threw herself into ranch life with the enthusiasm of someone finally free to make her own choices. She learned to milk the cow, expanded the vegetable garden, and even convinced Colt to let her help with the more dangerous work of breaking the wild Mustang he'd caught the previous summer. The horse, a spirited bay mare with intelligent eyes and a stubborn streak a mile wide, had been deemed unrideable by every cowhand in the county. But Wren approached her with patience and understanding, speaking to her in low, soothing tones that seemed to reach something deep in the animal's soul. "She's been hurt," Wren observed, running gentle hands along the mare's flanks. "See these? Scars! Someone tried to break her spirit instead of earning her trust." "Sounds familiar," Colt said, watching the way both horse and woman seemed to recognize something in each other. "The trick isn't to make her submit. It's to convince her that partnership is better than fighting alone." It was a good life they were building, quiet and honest and filled with the small satisfactions of daily work. Colt found himself looking forward to each morning, to the sight of Wren humming over breakfast, to the way she left wildflowers on his pillow and mended his clothes without being asked. She was healing. He could see it in the way her smiles came easier now, in how she no longer startled at sudden noises or positioned herself near exits in every room. But their peace was shattered on a humid Thursday afternoon when Tom Bradley came riding up the drive like the devil himself was on. "His heels! Colt!" he called out before his horse had even stopped. "You need to see this, both of you!" He thrust a newspaper at them, the Denver Post, 3 days old but bearing headlines that made Wren's face go white with shock. "Railroad Heiress Found Alive," the headline screamed. "Elizabeth Morrison Whitmore Discovered Living on Wyoming Ranch. Inheritance Battle Looms." Wren sank onto the porch steps, the paper trembling in her hands as she read. The article was thorough and damning, laying out details of her parentage that she'd never fully understood herself. Judge William Whitmore, it turned out, had been one of the wealthiest men in Colorado, with investments in mining, railroads, and vast tracts of land. His estate, valued at over $2 million, had been tied up in legal complications since his death. "According to newly discovered documents," Wren read aloud, her voice growing fainter with each word, "Judge Whitmore's daughter Catherine bore a child out of wedlock to Harrison Morrison before her death in 1851. The child, Elizabeth Catherine Whitmore, was raised by Morrison but never legally adopted. Under the terms of Judge Whitmore's will, his estate passes to his legitimate heirs, including any children of his daughter, regardless of their birth circumstances. $2 million. Tom whistled low. "Wren, do you understand what this means?" But Wren wasn't listening. She'd gone completely pale, staring at something else in the article. "Colt," she whispered, "look at this." She pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the story. "Harrison Morrison and prospective son-in-law Harold Blackwood have filed suit, claiming rights to the Whitmore estate through their previous guardianship and marriage contract with Miss Whitmore. However, legal experts suggest their claims may be invalid if Miss Whitmore was never legally under Morrison's authority. A case is expected to go before the Colorado Supreme Court. They're still fighting for the money," Colt said grimly. "It gets worse." Wren's voice was barely audible. "Listen to this. Mr. Blackwood, speaking to reporters, expressed confidence that his bride-to-be would return to honor her commitments once she fully understands the legal ramifications of her current situation. He noted that Miss Whitmore is currently believed to be staying with a Wyoming rancher of questionable reputation and suggested that her judgment may be compromised by her circumstances." The insult hit Colt like a physical blow. Questionable reputation. In the space of a few sentences, Blackwood had managed to impugn both his character and Wren's judgment. "There's more," Wren continued, her voice growing smaller. "Sources close to the Morrison family suggest that Miss Whitmore may be suffering from mental distress following her ordeal, and that her current living arrangements may not be in her best interests. Plans are underway to petition the court for a medical evaluation to determine her competency to make legal decisions regarding her inheritance." The newspaper crumpled in her hands as she finally looked up at Colt. They're going to claim I'm mentally incompetent. That's their new strategy. If they can't force me to marry Blackwood, they'll have me declared unfit to control my own inheritance. They can't do that, Tom protested. Can they? With enough money and the right lawyers? They can try. Wren stood slowly, the color gradually returning to her face. And if they succeed, they'll have me committed to an asylum while they fight over the estate. The full implications of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about marriage contracts or family obligations anymore. With $2 million at stake, Harrison Morrison and Harold Blackwood would use every weapon at their disposal to maintain control over Wren and her inheritance. We could run, Colt said quietly. Take the horses and head for Canada. Start. Over somewhere they'll never find us. With what money? They'll freeze my assets the moment they file their petition. Wren's voice was bitter. Besides, running away now would just prove their point about my mental state. Then we fight. How? They have lawyers, judges, politicians in their pockets. I have a silver locket and a lot of stubborn pride. Before Colt could answer, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. But this time it wasn't marshals or sheriffs. It was a single man on a fine black horse, dressed in an expensive suit, despite the heat and dust of travel. Miss Whitmore. The man dismounted, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to fine horses. My name is Jonathan Hartwell. I'm an attorney from Denver, and I've come to discuss a matter of some urgency regarding your inheritance. Wren stepped behind Colt instinctively. If Morrison sent you, Mr. Morrison most certainly did not send me, quite the opposite, in fact. Hartwell smiled, and there was something genuinely warm about it. I represent the estate of Judge William Whitmore. I've been searching for his missing granddaughter for 15 years. The words hit like a thunderbolt. Wren stared at the lawyer, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Granddaughter? Colt found his voice first. Indeed. You see, Judge Whitmore never disinherited his daughter Catherine, despite what Mr. Morrison has claimed. In fact, the judge's will specifically provides for any children Catherine might have, legitimate or otherwise. He was fond of his daughter and hoped she might one day return to claim her rightful place in the family. Hartwell reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio. I have here the original will, along with documentation proving Miss Whitmore's identity and legal status. She is not only the sole heir to her grandfather's estate, she's also been free to make her own legal decisions since the day she turned 18. But Morrison raised me, Wren protested weakly. He provided for me. He stole from you, Hartwell corrected gently. Every dollar he spent on your upbringing came from funds that rightfully belonged to you. Judge Whitmore established a trust specifically for his granddaughter's care and education. Morrison has been drawing from that trust for years, claiming expenses for your support while actually profiting handsomely from the arrangement. Colt felt a surge of rage so pure it nearly knocked him backward. He stole from her. Her whole life he's been stealing from her. More than that, I'm afraid. The marriage contract with Mr. Blackwood was part of an elaborate scheme to legitimize Morrison's control over the estate. If Miss Whitmore had married Blackwood, her husband would have gained legal authority over her inheritance, and Morrison would have continued to profit through their business partnership. So, I really am free. Wren's voice was small, disbelieving. You've been free all along, Miss Whitmore. You just didn't know it. Hartwell's expression grew serious. However, I must warn you, Morrison and Blackwood are not going to give up easily. They've already filed preliminary motions questioning your competency and claiming rights to the estate. The next few months are going to be very difficult. What do I need to do? Return to Denver with me. Face them in court, with proper legal representation this time. Show the world that you're a competent, intelligent woman, perfectly capable of managing her own affairs. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Wren looked from Hartwell to Colt, her eyes reflecting the magnitude of the decision before her. "And if I lose, if they somehow convince a judge that I'm incompetent, then you'll be exactly where you are now, with nothing to lose and everything to gain." Hartwell's voice was gentle but firm. "But if you win, Miss Whitmore, you'll not only be free, you'll have the resources to ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else." Colt watched Wren's face as she processed this information. He could see the exact moment when the frightened girl disappeared and someone stronger took her place. Someone who'd inherited more than money from her grandfather. She'd inherited his sense of justice. "How long would I be gone?" she asked. "Several months, possibly. The legal proceedings will be complex, and there are business matters to sort out as well. The estate includes significant holdings that have been mismanaged in your absence." Wren turned to Colt, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have to go. You know I have to go. I know." The words tasted like ashes, but he forced them out. "When do we leave?" Hartwell raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Merrick, I'm not sure you understand." "I understand perfectly. The woman I love is about to walk into a legal battle with people who've already proven they'll stop at nothing to control her. You think I'm going to let her face that alone?" "Colt, no!" Wren's voice was firm. "Your ranch, your life, you can't just abandon everything. This ranch will still be here when we get back, but if I let you go alone, I might lose you forever." He took her hands in his, not caring that Hartwell was watching. "I told you I loved you. That means all of it. The easy parts and the hard ones. It could be dangerous. Morrison and Blackwood have connections, influence, then it's a good thing I know how to handle myself in a fight." For a moment she wavered, hope and fear warring in her expression. Then she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen since Tom arrived with the newspaper. "Are you sure? Really sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Hartwell cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I may, Mr. Merrick's presence in Denver might actually be beneficial. A respectable rancher willing to vouch for Miss Whitmore's character could be quite helpful in court. Then it's settled." Wren squeezed Colt's hands. "We go to Denver, we fight this battle, and we win." As they began making plans for the journey, Colt couldn't help but think about how completely his life had changed. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a broken-down rancher with nothing left to lose. Now he was preparing to fight for a fortune he'd never dreamed of, beside a woman who'd become more precious to him than all the gold in Colorado. Whatever lay ahead in Denver, they'd face it together. And sometimes that was all the advantage you needed. Denver in late autumn was a city transformed by ambition and gold. The streets bustled with mining magnates, railroad barons, and the endless stream of fortune-seekers who flowed through the territory like water finding its level. But beneath the veneer of prosperity, Colt could sense the undercurrents of power and corruption that made men like Harrison Morrison rich and kept people like Wren trapped in gilded cages. Their hotel suite overlooked the heart of the financial district, where Morrison's offices occupied an entire floor of the newest, most impressive building. From their window, Colt could see people scurrying in and out like ants serving their queen, carrying the weight of an empire built on other people's dreams. "He's watching us," Wren observed, standing beside him at the window. "Morrison, he knows. We're here. Good. Let him watch. Let him worry." 3 days had passed since their arrival, 3 days of meetings with Hartwell and his associates, of reviewing documents and preparing for what promised to be the legal battle of the decade. The newspapers had picked up the story with relish, painting it as a David and Goliath tale that sold papers and scandalized society matrons across the territory. But Colt could see the toll it was taking on Wren. She slept poorly, ate little, and jumped at unexpected sounds despite her outward show of determination. This morning she'd woken from another nightmare about being locked away in an asylum, and he'd held her until the trembling stopped. "Mr. Hartwell wants to see us again." "This afternoon," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "More preparation for tomorrow's hearing." Tomorrow. The preliminary hearing that would determine whether Wren was competent to make her own legal decisions. If Morrison and Blackwood succeeded in having her declared mentally unfit, everything else would become academic. They'd control her inheritance and her future, and there would be nothing Colt or anyone else could do to stop them. How are you feeling about it? Terrified, she admitted. They're going to bring up every mistake I've made, every moment of desperation or poor judgment. They'll make living with Jake's gang sound like evidence of madness instead of survival. And we'll counter with the truth that you're a strong, intelligent woman who escaped an impossible situation and built a new life for herself. Will that be enough? Before Colt could answer, a knock came at their door. Hartwell entered at Wren's invitation, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "I'm afraid I have difficult news," he said without preamble. "Morrison's lawyers have filed additional motions this morning. They're claiming that your current relationship with Mr. Merrick is further evidence of impaired judgment." Wren's face flushed with anger. What exactly are they claiming? That a woman of sound mind and proper upbringing would never choose to live unmarried with a man of lower social station. Hartwell's distaste for the argument was evident in his voice. "They're painting your attachment to Mr. Merrick as proof of mental deficiency." "Those sons of—" Colt began, but Wren cut him off with a sharp gesture. "What else? They've also produced witnesses who will testify to your erratic behavior during your time in Colorado. Servants who claim you were prone to violent outbursts, periods of melancholy, and conversations with imaginary companions." "Paid witnesses," Wren said bitterly, "or threatened ones?" "Undoubtedly, but their testimony will carry weight with a judge who doesn't know you personally." Hartwell sat down heavily. "There's more. They've requested that you be examined by Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, Harold Blackwood's brother, who runs a private sanatorium outside the city." The news hit like a physical blow. Colt saw Wren go pale, saw her hands begin to shake as the implications sank in. "They want to have me committed for evaluation," she whispered. "The motion requests a 30-day observation period to determine your mental state. If Dr. Blackwood finds you incompetent, which he will, since his brother stands to inherit everything if I'm declared unfit." Wren stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "It's brilliant, actually. They get me locked away in a place they control, with a doctor who has every reason to find me insane. We'll fight it, of course. But I want you to understand what we're up against." Hartwell pulled out a thick folder. "They have money, influence, and connections throughout the territorial government. The judge hearing your case, Horace Pemberton, has business ties to several of Morrison's companies. So we're fighting a rigged game." "Not entirely. Judge Pemberton may be connected to Morrison, but he's also proud of his reputation for fairness. If we can present a compelling case for your competency, he'll be reluctant to rule against the evidence just to favor his business partners." Colt moved to stand behind Wren, his hands settling on her shoulders. "What do you need from us? Character witnesses. People who can testify to Miss Whitmore's intelligence, stability, and sound judgment. Unfortunately, most of her recent associations have been with, well, outlaws and fugitives. Not exactly the sort of references that impress territorial judges." "What about Sheriff Stone? He dealt with Wren fairly when the marshals came." "A possibility, but we need more respectable citizens who can speak to her character." Hartwell's expression was grim. "The problem is, Morrison has had years to poison opinion against her. He's told everyone who would listen that she's mentally unstable, that her mother's madness has manifested in the daughter." "My mother wasn't mad," Wren said quietly. "She was desperate. There's a difference." "Of course there is. But desperation and madness can look very similar to people who've never experienced either." That evening, as Colt and Wren ate dinner in the hotel restaurant, he became aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Word of their presence had spread through Denver's social circles like wildfire, and everywhere they went, people pointed and murmured behind their hands. "The infamous Elizabeth Whitmore," he heard one woman whisper to her companion, "living in sin with that rough rancher fellow. Absolutely scandalous." I heard she was raised by criminals, came the reply. No wonder she turned out so badly. Blood. Will tell, as they say. Wren's hand tightened on her fork, but she kept eating with determined composure. Only Colt could see the cost of maintaining that facade, the way her jaw clenched with each whispered insult. We could leave, he said quietly. Take the next train west and never look back. With what money? They've frozen my accounts pending the hearing. She took a sip of wine, her voice steady despite the hurt in her eyes. Besides, running would just prove their point. The mad heiress, fleeing from justice and reality. You're not mad. I know that. You know that. But do they? She gestured toward the dining room, full of Denver's elite, all of whom seemed to be watching their table with fascination. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a well-dressed man with silver hair and intelligent eyes. He stopped. Beside their table, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command, Miss Whitmore. Forgive the intrusion, but I'm Judge William Harrison. I knew your grandfather quite well. Wren looked up warily. Judge Harrison, may I sit for a moment? I have something I think you should know. At Wren's nod, he settled into the empty chair across from them. Your grandfather was one of the finest men I ever knew. Brilliant legal mind, but more than that, he had an unwavering sense of justice. He would be very proud of the courage you're showing. Thank you, sir. I want you to know that there are people in this city who remember William Whitmore with respect and affection. People who don't believe the stories Morrison has been spreading about his granddaughter. Judge Harrison's voice carried the weight of authority. I cannot speak for my colleague Judge Pemberton's ruling, but I can tell you that the legal community is watching this case with great interest. What does that mean exactly? It means that if there's any appearance of impropriety or bias in the proceedings, there will be appeals, reviews, and public scrutiny that Morrison cannot control. The judge smiled slightly. Your grandfather had many friends, Miss Whitmore. Some of us are still in positions to honor his memory. After Judge Harrison left, Wren sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice held a note of something Colt hadn't heard before, hope tempered by steely determination. They want to paint me as a mad woman, she said, a poor, deluded creature who needs to be protected from herself. Yes. Then tomorrow, we show them exactly who Catherine Whitmore's daughter really is. That night, Colt lay awake, listening to Wren's steady breathing beside him. She'd finally fallen asleep after hours of restless tossing, and he didn't want to wake her with his own movements. Tomorrow would be the most important day of her life, the moment when she would either claim her birthright or lose everything to the men who'd already stolen so much. In his coat pocket, carefully wrapped in soft cloth, lay his father's rifle, not the weapon itself, but something more precious. The deed to the Merrick Ranch, signed over to Wren that afternoon in Hartwell's office. If everything went wrong tomorrow, if they somehow lost everything, at least she would have a home to return to. A place where she would always be welcome, always be valued for who she was, rather than what she might inherit. It wasn't much compared to a $2 million fortune, but it was his to give, and he'd given it freely. Because sometimes love meant holding on, and sometimes it meant knowing when to let go. Tomorrow would determine which kind of love Wren needed from him. Outside their window, Denver slept uneasily under a blanket of stars, while in the distance, the mountains stood guard like ancient sentinels. Somewhere in those peaks, Jake Malone had taught a frightened girl how to survive. Tomorrow, that same girl would prove she'd learned how to do more than just survive. She'd learned how to fight. The territorial courthouse stood like a monument. To frontier justice, its sandstone walls, weathered by mountain winds and carved with the names of men who'd shaped Colorado's destiny. As Colt helped Wren from their carriage, he could see crowds gathering on the steps, newspapermen with their cameras, curiosity seekers drawn by scandal, and the well-dressed representatives of Denver's financial elite who'd come to witness the spectacle. Remember, Hartwell murmured as they climbed the courthouse steps. Dignity and composure above all else. They want to see you break down. Give them evidence of instability. Don't give them the satisfaction. Wren nodded, her face pale but determined. She wore a simple but elegant dress of deep blue wool, her hair arranged in a conservative style that spoke of respectability rather than rebellion. Only Colt knew about the small silver locket hidden beneath the high neckline, her mother's final gift resting close to her heart. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with spectators lining the walls and spilling into the hallway. Judge Pemberton entered with appropriate ceremony, his black robes lending gravity to proceedings that felt more like a public entertainment than a legal hearing. He was older than Colt had expected, with snow-white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. This hearing, Judge Pemberton began, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room, will determine whether Miss Elizabeth Catherine Whitmore possesses the mental capacity to manage her own legal and financial affairs. Mr. Cranston, you may present your arguments. Morrison's lead attorney was a thin, sharp-featured man who rose with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. Your Honor, we will demonstrate today that Miss Whitmore suffers from hereditary mental deficiency that renders her unfit to control a vast fortune. Her recent behavior, fleeing from her lawful guardians, associating with criminals, entering into an improper relationship with a man of questionable character, all point to severe impairment of judgment. Colt felt his hands clench into fists as Cranston painted Wren as a damaged, pitiable creature who needed protection from her own poor decisions. The lawyer's words were carefully chosen to sound concerned rather than accusatory, but the underlying message was clear. Elizabeth Whitmore was too broken to be trusted with her own life. Furthermore, Cranston continued, we have evidence that Miss Whitmore's mother suffered from similar mental afflictions before her untimely death. The family history of instability, combined with the traumatic circumstances of Miss Whitmore's upbringing, have created a dangerous combination that threatens not only her own welfare, but the proper stewardship of a significant estate. When Cranston called his first witness, Colt recognized the man from newspaper photographs, Harold Blackwood himself, impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of cold authority that came from a lifetime of getting his way. Blackwood took the oath with theatrical solemnity, his eyes finding Wren's across the courtroom with possessive intensity. Mr. Blackwood, Cranston began, you were engaged to marry Miss Whitmore. In your interactions with her, did you observe any concerning behaviors? I'm afraid I did, Blackwood replied, his voice heavy with false regret. Elizabeth was prone to violent outbursts, particularly when discussing our upcoming marriage. She would fly into rages, throw objects, even threaten self-harm if forced. To discuss wedding preparations, did you interpret these behaviors as normal pre-wedding nerves? At first, yes, but as time went on, the episodes became more frequent and more severe. She began talking to people who weren't there, insisting that her deceased mother was giving her advice. On one occasion, I found her in the garden at midnight, having what appeared to be an animated conversation with empty air. Wren's lawyer rose to object, but Judge Pemberton allowed the testimony to continue. Colt watched Wren's face as Blackwood painted her as a delusional madwoman, saw the way she held herself perfectly still, despite the obvious lies being told about her. Did Miss Whitmore ever express coherent reasons for her reluctance to marry? Nothing that made sense. She claimed I was too old, that the marriage was against her will, that her father had no right to arrange such a union. Clearly the products of a disordered mind, since the marriage contract was entirely legal and proper. When Hartwell rose for cross-examination, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted subtly. Mr. Blackwood, how old are you? I failed to see the relevance. Please answer the question. 64. And Miss Whitmore was how old when this marriage was arranged? 18, I believe. So a 64-year-old man arranged to marry an 18-year-old girl. And when she objected to this arrangement, you interpreted her objections as evidence of mental illness. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. The age difference is not uncommon in marriages of this sort. Marriages of what sort, Mr. Blackwood? Business arrangements? Financial transactions? Objection! Cranston leaped to his feet. Counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained, Judge Pemberton ruled. But Colt could see that Hartwell had made his point. The questioning continued for another hour, with Hartwell systematically dismantling Blackwood's testimony while revealing the financial motivations behind his desire to marry Wren. By the time Blackwood left the witness stand, his face was flushed with anger, and his careful facade of concern had crumbled into obvious resentment. Morrison took the stand next, presenting himself as the grieving surrogate, father who'd done his best to care for a troubled child. His testimony was smoother than Blackwood's, more carefully rehearsed, but Hartwell's cross-examination revealed telling inconsistencies. Mr. Morrison, you claim to have provided for Miss Whitmore's care and education out of the goodness of your heart? Of course, Catherine was special to me. I felt obligated to care for her daughter. And yet you drew funds for her support from a trust established by her grandfather, did you not? Morrison's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. I was entitled to reimbursement for expenses that far exceeded the actual costs of her care according to the financial records we've reviewed. I provided the best of everything, including isolation from her mother's family, control over her social contacts, and an arranged marriage to your business partner. Very generous indeed. When the prosecution rested, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Cranston had painted a picture of hereditary madness and dangerous instability, but Hartwell's cross-examinations had revealed the financial motivations lurking beneath the surface. Now it was time for Wren to defend herself. Your Honor, Hartwell announced, the defense calls Miss Elizabeth Catherine Whitmore to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as Wren rose, her spine straight and her head held high. She walked to the witness stand with measured steps, placed her hand on the Bible, and spoke the oath in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the room. Miss Whitmore, Hartwell began gently, tell us about your childhood with Mr. Morrison. Wren's voice was calm but filled with quiet strength. As she began to speak, I was raised in isolation, told that my mother had died in madness and that I carried the same taint. I was forbidden to mention her name, to ask questions about her family, or to form friendships with anyone Mr. Morrison didn't approve of. Did you ever show signs of the mental instability Mr. Blackwood described? I showed signs of desperation. When you're told repeatedly that you're mentally defective, when you're controlled and manipulated at every turn, when you're forced into an engagement with a man old enough to be your grandfather, yes, you fight back. But fighting injustice isn't madness, Mr. Hartwell. It's sanity. Why did you choose to live with the outlaw group led by Jake Malone? Because they treated me with more kindness and respect than my own supposed family ever did. Jake Malone may have been an outlaw, but he never lied to me, never tried to sell me like livestock, never told me I was worthless or broken. Her voice grew stronger with each word. He taught me to survive, to think for myself, to believe that I had value as a human being. And your relationship with Mr. Merrick? For the first time, Wren's composure softened, and she looked directly at Colt. Colt Merrick is the finest man I've ever known. He treated me with dignity when I had nothing to offer in return. He offered me freedom when everyone else wanted to cage me. If choosing to love such a man is evidence of madness, then I'm proud to be mad. The courtroom stirred at her words, and Colt felt his heart swell with pride and love for this extraordinary woman who refused to be broken by those who sought to diminish her. Cranston's cross-examination was brutal, designed to provoke the kind of outburst that would confirm his claims about Wren's instability. He questioned her about every decision she'd made, every moment of desperation or poor judgment, painting her escape from Morrison's control as the actions of a deranged mind. But Wren never broke. She answered each question with calm logic, explaining her reasoning without apologizing for her choices. When Cranston suggested that her love for Colt was evidence of impaired judgment, she looked him straight in the eye and delivered the line that would be quoted in newspapers across the territory. "Mr. Cranston, the only impaired judgment I've ever shown was in trusting the people who claimed to care for my welfare while stealing my inheritance. I won't make that mistake again." As the afternoon wore on and testimony concluded, Judge Pemberton called for a recess to consider his ruling. The courtroom erupted in conversation as spectators filed out, but Colt's attention was focused entirely on Wren, who sat beside him with her hands folded calmly in her lap. "How do you think it went?" she asked quietly. "I think," Colt said, taking her hand in his, "that your grandfather would be very proud of the woman his granddaughter became." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, and the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the courthouse windows. Soon they would learn whether justice and truth were enough to overcome money and influence. But regardless of Judge Pemberton's ruling, Colt knew one thing with absolute certainty. Elizabeth Catherine Whitmore was the sanest, strongest, most remarkable person he'd ever known. And no court decision could change that truth. The rain had stopped by the time Judge Pemberton returned to the bench, but the air in the courtroom still felt heavy with expectation. Colt watched Wren's profile as she waited for the ruling that would determine her future. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm, but he could see the pulse beating rapidly at her throat, the only sign of the tension she was fighting to control. "This case," Judge Pemberton began, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration, "has presented the court with questions that go to the heart of our understanding of individual liberty and family responsibility. We have heard testimony suggesting that Miss Whitmore suffers from hereditary mental deficiency. We have also heard compelling evidence that her alleged symptoms are better explained by the natural responses of an intelligent young woman to intolerable circumstances." The judge paused, his eyes moving across the crowded courtroom before settling on Wren. The court notes that Miss Whitmore's testimony was lucid, reasoned, and demonstrated a clear understanding of complex legal and financial matters. Her explanations for her past actions, while perhaps unconventional, show logical thinking and sound moral reasoning. Colt felt a flicker of hope, but Pemberton wasn't finished. However, the court must also consider the significant financial interests at stake. The Whitmore estate represents one of the largest fortunes in Colorado Territory, and its proper stewardship affects not only Miss Whitmore, but numerous business interests and employees throughout the region. The hope in Colt's chest began to fade. This sounded like the prelude to a ruling in Morrison's favor, wrapped in careful legal language, but devastating nonetheless. "That said," Pemberton continued, "the court finds that the evidence presented does not support a finding of mental incompetency. Miss Elizabeth Catherine Whitmore has demonstrated both the intellectual capacity and emotional stability necessary to manage her own affairs." The courtroom erupted. Spectators cheered and shouted, newspapermen rushed for the doors, and Morrison's team huddled in urgent, angry conversation. Through it all, Wren sat perfectly still, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd heard. "Furthermore," Pemberton raised his voice above the chaos, "the court finds that the marriage contract between Miss Whitmore and Mr. Blackwood is null and void, having been entered into by parties without proper legal authority over Miss Whitmore's person or property." "Your Honor!" Cranston leaped to his feet. "We respectfully request an immediate appeal." "Mr. Cranston, you may file whatever appeals you choose, but this court's ruling stands. Miss Whitmore is hereby declared competent to manage her own legal and financial affairs with all rights and privileges pertaining thereto." As the judge's gavel fell, the celebration around them was immediate and raucous. Hartwell pumped Colt's Hand with grinning enthusiasm, while reporters shouted questions and well-wishers pressed forward to congratulate Wren. But through it all, Colt was aware only of the woman beside him, who had finally claimed the freedom that had always been rightfully hers. "We won," she said quietly, wonder in her voice. "We actually won." "You won," Colt corrected. "This was your fight, your victory." She turned to him then, and he saw tears of joy streaming down her face. "Our victory. I couldn't have done this without you." Before he could respond, she was in his arms, kissing him with fierce joy while the courtroom celebrated around them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Colt became aware that someone was approaching through the crowd. Harrison Morrison stood before them, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind him, Harold Blackwood looked like a man who'd just watched his fortune disappear into smoke. "This isn't over," Morrison said, his voice low and dangerous. "There will be appeals, investigations. I won't let some ranch hand steal what's rightfully mine." "What's rightfully yours?" Wren's voice was steady, but Colt could feel the anger radiating from her. "You mean the money you stole from my grandfather's trust? The inheritance you tried to claim through fraud and intimidation? I raised you, provided for you when no one else would. You used me, you kept me prisoner and tried to sell me like cattle." Wren stepped closer to Morrison, her green eyes blazing. "But that's over now, all of it." "You think you've won something?" Blackwood spoke for the first time, his cultured voice dripping with venom. "You're nobody, girl, a bastard raised by criminals. You may have this court fooled, but society will never accept you." "Then society can go to hell," Colt said pleasantly, moving to stand beside Wren. "She doesn't need their acceptance. She has something better. She has the truth." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied Colt. "You think you're going to live happily ever after with her money? Think again, ranch hand. There are ways to make life very difficult for people who cross me. Is that a threat? It's a promise." Before the confrontation could escalate further, Sheriff Stone appeared at Colt's shoulder. The lawman had traveled to Denver to testify on Wren's behalf, and his presence carried the authority of frontier justice. "Gentlemen," Stone said mildly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, "I think this conversation is over. Miss Whitmore, Mr. Merrick, congratulations on your victory." Morrison and Blackwood withdrew, but not before Morrison delivered a final, poison-filled look that promised this battle was far from finished. That evening, as Denver celebrated around them, Colt and Wren found themselves alone in their hotel suite for the first time since the trial began. The magnitude of what had happened was still sinking in. Wren was not only free but wealthy beyond anything either of them had imagined. $2 million, she said, staring out at the gaslit streets below. "I keep saying the number, but it doesn't feel real. It's real. All of it. The money, the freedom, the future. It's all yours now." She turned from the window, her expression troubled. "What happens now, Colt? What happens to us?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had been ready to face during the long months of legal preparation. Now that the battle was won, they had to confront the reality of their vastly changed circumstances. "What do you want to happen?" She struggled with the words. "I want to go home. Back to the ranch, back to the life we were building together. But is that fair to you, now that I have all this money, all these opportunities? You think money changes how I feel about you? I think money changes everything. Look at Morrison, at Blackwood. It made them into monsters. What if it does the same to me?" Colt crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took her hands in his. "Money didn't make them monsters, Wren. They were already monsters. The money just gave them the power to act on it. You're not like them. You never could be. How can you be sure?" "Because I know you. I know the woman who leaves wildflowers on my table and reads poetry by firelight. I know the person who risked everything to save a struggling calf and taught a broken-down rancher how to hope again." He lifted her hands to his lips, kissing each knuckle gently. "That woman doesn't disappear just because she has money in the bank. But what kind of life can we have? You're a rancher, I'm an heiress. People will say, People will say whatever they want to say. They always have. Colt's voice was firm, certain. The only question that matters is what we say, what we choose. Wren was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but determined. I choose you. I choose the ranch, the simple life, the chance to build something real together. I choose love over money, freedom over society's expectations, even though I have nothing to offer you that compares to what you've inherited. You have everything to offer me that matters. Your heart, your strength, your belief in me when no one else would. She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. Besides, I think there might be some advantages to having a wealthy partner, such as being able to pay off the mortgage on the ranch, buy back the cattle you had, to sell, maybe even expand the operation. Her eyes sparkled with growing excitement. We could build something amazing together, Colt. Not just a ranch, but a real home. A place where people like us, people who don't quite fit anywhere else, can find belonging. The vision she painted was beautiful and impossible, and absolutely perfect. Colt could see it all. The ranch restored and thriving, children running. Through the meadows where he and Wren had first walked together, a life built on love and hard work and the simple satisfaction of tending growing things. There's just one problem, he said, reaching into his coat pocket. What? He pulled out a small velvet box, the one item he'd purchased during their weeks in Denver, using the last of his savings for something he'd thought he might never have the chance to give her. I can't offer you a fortune or a mansion or a place in high society. All I can offer you is a life on a struggling ranch with a man who loves you more than his own breath. Wren's eyes widened as he dropped to one knee, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a single, perfect emerald. Elizabeth Catherine Whitmore, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my reason for getting up every morning for the rest of my life? For a heartbeat, she stood frozen, staring down at him with tears streaming down her face. Then she was on her knees beside him, her arms around his neck, her lips on his. Yes, she whispered against his mouth. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes, as he slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah's rings, which he'd had reset with Wren's birthstone. Colt felt the last pieces of his broken heart finally heal. The woman in his arms was nothing like the wife he'd lost, but she was everything the man he'd become needed. Outside their window, Denver sparkled with electric lights and ambitious dreams. But inside their small room, two people who'd found each other against impossible odds were planning a future built on the simple, revolutionary idea that love was worth more than all the gold in Colorado. Tomorrow they would begin the journey home. Back to the ranch where their story had begun. Back to the place where Elizabeth Whitmore had become Wren, where a broken-down rancher had learned to hope again, and where two wounded souls had discovered that sometimes the best way to heal was to take care of each other. The legal battle was over, but their real adventure was just beginning. 6 months later, spring had returned to the Wyoming territory with a vengeance. The creek ran full and clear, carrying snowmelt from the mountains in a joyous rush toward the valley floor. The meadows burst with wildflowers, lupine and Indian paintbrush, prairie roses and mountain asters, and the cottonwoods along the water's edge whispered with new leaves that caught the afternoon light like scattered emeralds. Colt stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching his wife hang laundry on the line they'd strung between two sturdy posts. Even 6 months after their wedding, the sight of her moving with easy confidence around their home filled him with a quiet wonder. She wore a simple cotton dress, her dark hair braided back for practicality, and hummed the melody of a hymn she'd learned from Mrs. Bradley. The ranch itself had been transformed by the careful application of Wren's inheritance. The mortgage was paid in full. The barn had a new roof, and the pastures once again held cattle, good breeding stock purchased from ranchers in Montana and Colorado. They'd hired 2 hands to help with the daily work, good men who treated Wren with the respect she deserved, and never questioned her right to make decisions about her own property. But the most important changes weren't visible in ledger books or property improvements. They lived in the way Wren laughed at his jokes, in the way she'd started a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, in the comfortable silences they shared over morning coffee and evening meals. The fear had left her eyes, replaced by the deep contentment of someone who'd finally found where she belonged. "The Patterson children will be here soon," Wren called out, securing a sheet to the line with wooden clothespins. "Mary Beth is finally ready to tackle long division, and Tommy wants to learn about that steam engine article in Harper's Magazine. You sure you're not taking on too much? Between the school and helping with the ranch?" "I'm fine, Colt. Better than fine." She turned to smile at him, one hand resting unconsciously on the gentle swell of her belly. The child would come in late autumn, according to the doctor in Cheyenne, and already Colt found himself planning modifications to the house, wondering whether they'd need a larger barn, imagining the sound of children's laughter mixing with the call of meadowlarks. Their peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the approach of a familiar rider. Tom Bradley cantered up the drive, his expression serious despite the cheerful wave he offered from a distance. "Afternoon, you two," he called, out, dismounting near the porch. "Hope you don't mind the interruption, but I thought you'd want to see this." He pulled a newspaper from his saddlebags, the Denver Post, only 3 days old. The headline made Colt's stomach clench. "Railroad Baron Morrison dies in federal custody. Blackwood flees country." Wren read over his shoulder, her face growing pale as they absorbed the details. Harrison Morrison had been arrested 2 weeks earlier on charges of fraud and embezzlement connected to his management of the Whitmore Trust. Federal investigators had uncovered decades of financial manipulation, forged documents, and illegal business practices. Rather than face trial and certain conviction, Morrison had apparently suffered a heart attack in his jail cell. Harold Blackwood, named as a co-conspirator in the scheme, had fled to Mexico before he could be arrested. Federal marshals were still searching for him, but most observers believed he'd disappeared permanently into the wilderness south of the border. "So it's really over," Wren said quietly. "Looks that way," Tom agreed. "The article says they recovered most of the stolen funds. You'll probably get back a good deal more than they originally estimated." Colt watched his wife's face carefully, looking for signs of the old fear or anger. Instead, he saw something like sadness, not for Morrison or Blackwood, but for the years of pain and manipulation that had finally ended. "I should feel something," she said. "Relief, satisfaction, something. But mostly I just feel empty. Like those men took up so much space in my thoughts that I don't know what to do now that they're gone." "You fill that space with better things," Colt said gently. "With the life we're building, the children you're teaching, the family we're starting." After Tom left, they sat together on the porch swing Colt had built as a wedding gift, watching the sun begin its descent toward the mountains. The spring evening was soft and warm, filled with the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and the clear notes of a meadowlark's song. "I've been thinking," Wren said, leaning against his shoulder, "about what to do with the additional money when it comes back from Morrison's estate. Oh, I want to establish a school, a real school with proper buildings and supplies, somewhere children can learn not just reading and arithmetic, but thinking for themselves, questioning what they're told, standing up for what's right." She looked up at him, her green eyes bright with purpose. "Especially girls. Girls who need to know they have choices, that they don't have to accept whatever life other people plan for them." "That sounds perfect," Colt said, and meant it. "Your grandfather would approve, I think." "I hope so. I like to think he's watching sometimes, seeing what became of the granddaughter he never got to know." As if summoned by her words, a gentle breeze stirred the flowers in the garden, carrying their scent across the porch in a sweet benediction. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, and in the barn, one of the horses whinnied softly to its companions. "Do you ever miss it?" Colt asked suddenly. The excitement, the drama, the feeling that everything was at stake? Wren considered the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the intensity of it, the feeling that every day might be the last, that every choice mattered desperately. But then I think about what we have now. The quiet certainty of waking up beside you every morning, the satisfaction of work well done, the simple pleasure of watching things grow. She placed his hand on her belly, where their child rested safe and warm. This is better, Colt. This is worth all the drama we survived to get here. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Wren surprised him by taking out the small wooden horse Jake Malone had carved for her so many years ago. She'd kept it all this time, through her escape from Morrison's house, her months with the outlaws, her arrival at the ranch, and the long legal battle in Denver. "I want to put this away," she said, holding the little horse in her palm. "Not because I'm ashamed of it or want to forget Jake, but because I don't need it anymore. I'm not that frightened girl who needed something to remind her of home. I am home now." Colt watched as she wrapped the horse carefully in soft cloth and placed it in the trunk at the foot of their bed. Not hidden, but preserved. A reminder of where she'd come from and how far she'd traveled to reach this moment of peace. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling for the night, Wren spoke one last time. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for believing I was worth saving when I thought I was beyond repair, for showing me that love doesn't have to hurt, that trust doesn't have to be earned through suffering. You saved yourself, Wren. I just had the privilege of watching you do it. We saved each other." Outside their window, the Wyoming sky stretched endless and star-filled above the mountains, while somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to his mate across the darkness. The sounds were wild and free and beautiful, like the love that had brought two broken souls together in this quiet corner of the world. In the morning, there would be cattle to tend and children to teach, letters to write about the school Wren wanted to build, and plans to make for the child growing beneath her heart. There would be the 1,000 small tasks that made up a life well lived, the daily choices that mattered more than any grand gesture. But tonight, there was simply this: the comfort of shared warmth, the security of belonging, and the deep satisfaction of two people who'd learned that sometimes the greatest adventures end not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet miracle of coming home. In her sleep, Wren smiled and turned toward him, and Colt thought about the girl who'd stood in shackles at a county auction, wild-haired and defiant and utterly alone. That girl was gone now, transformed into the woman beside him, strong and free and loved beyond measure. It had been quite a journey from that dusty auction block to this warm bed in a house filled with love and laughter. But then, the best journeys always were the ones that led you home to yourself and to the person who helped you remember who you were meant to be. Outside, the wind sang through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the meadow, new wildflowers prepared to bloom with the dawn.